I don't.
Meeting.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Berkshire conference call. We're doing our first Berkshire conference call using the Zoom software. So you will be able to view this on the Berkshire podcast, found on iTunes, and on if you don't use an Apple phone, if you use an Android, you can actually download it from the Podomatic app. And I will also upload this video to my YouTube channel. So if you just go to Evan Mulch, EvanMulch, you'll be able to see this. As long as the software works, as long as the recording goes well, and the Zoom software allows me to upload it. But welcome, Pastor Charles Roberts, to this episode of the Berkshire podcast. I've gotten to know you over the last, I think, two and a half years, maybe. The president emeritus of the John Birch Society, John McManus, contacted me to contact you. And so you have quite a history in the John Birch Society because you were an excellent host of speakers when you lived in, I believe it was the state of New York, and you got to know some of our top leaders. And then eventually you moved here to South Carolina, back to your home state, and you're always a great source of knowledge for me. And so the topic of this conversation is going to be the dangers of sending kids to government schools. And we've invited members of the John Birch Society to join us, and also people who are just interested in the John Birch Society to join us on this. It's a conference call is what we're doing. And at the end of it, you won't be able to hear it, but there will be a Q&A, but we do turn off the recording before the Q&A begins. So thank you for joining us, Pastor Charles Roberts. Please let us know about yourself, why you got involved in. There's not many pastors that are interested in exposing those that are trying to destroy families and our government, our constitutional republic. So talk a little bit about how you got interested in this and why you got involved in the John Birch Society.
Way back in the early to mid 1960s, when I was growing up in Columbia, South Carolina, I became interested in political issues as a young teenager, and I knew several people who were in a minor way politically active relating to politics here in South Carolina back in those turbulent times. And even as a young teenager, I was given a book to read called None Dare Call It Conspiracy, and a number of other really good quality items like that. I can't remember the name of the guy who wrote that, but there was another one very popular.
Gary Allen.
It wasn't Gary Allen. It was the one before that was so popular. Something like Death of a Nation. Anyway.
Okay.
So that made me aware of some of the things that were going on in the larger parts of society. I well recall where I was in the fourth grade when we got the announcement about the Kennedy assassination. So I was exposed to a lot of things going on in our culture and our society that there was sort of a surface explanation for some of them. But then the more I dug back, I realized there was more than one explanation for some of the things that were impacting my life as I understood it at the time. It would be much later, that I really became aware of what we would call the conspiracy with a capital C. And to be honest, I really wasn't familiar enough with the JBS at the time to realize that this is something that Robert Welch and the early members of the society had focused on, and so that we're blowing the whistle about early on. So when I was living in upstate New York, pastor of a church there, an elder at a sister church that was very close to ours geographically and theologically, I knew was active in the John Birch Society, and I contacted him and said, I want to talk to you about this because this is something that I'm very interested in. So that's a little bit sort of a truncated, very Cliff Notes version of my background. I'll never forget something I heard said one time. I can't find the origin of the source, but supposedly attributed to J.P. Morgan. He said, for everything there is a good reason, and then there's a real reason. And I've seen that to be the case time and time again. And that's especially true when it comes to something like public education, government schools.
And so the public school system has changed drastically in the past few years, and the John Birch Society has done its best to expose the fact that having a federal Department of Education is an unconstitutional organization. And this is before my time, but President Reagan had promised people in America that the first thing, or one of the things he would do when he's president, is he would get rid of the Federal Department of Education, or U.S. Department of Education, and he would allow the states to once again make decisions for their public schools without the federal government intervening in it. But that never happened, and that is an important thing for Americans to remember. And so we've continually seen the destruction of the public school system, and there are great teachers that are trying to still do their best. That, you know, there's Christians that are public school teachers that are trying to not obey all the rules or all the things that Common Core wants them to do, and it's becoming harder and harder because of the amount of control the Common Core promoters have over what's taught and what has to be said in a classroom. Can you talk a little bit about what you see going on right now in the public school system, and why it's important for Americans to wake up to what's going on?
Yes, I'd be glad to. But before I do that, I'd like to preface it by giving my own experience as having been educated in the public school system here in South Carolina, right up through high school and the University of South Carolina, from which I graduated in 1977. When I went to elementary school and junior high school in Columbia, we had prayer over the PA system every day, those kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
And the public school system was largely a Protestant evangelical place for people in middle-class neighborhoods to educate their kids. What we are seeing today, however, is the culmination and the fruition of the seeds that were laid in public education really from the very beginning. Frankly, as a pastor and as someone concerned about these issues, I get very tired of hearing people say, well, the big problem in the public school started when they banned prayer in public school. I guess prayer is better in public school is better than nothing, but it depends on who you're praying to and what you're praying about. And the way that the public school system is set up, if someone is a Satanist, a Muslim, a Hindu, a Buddhist, a Christian, a Jew, whatever, then they have legal ground to say, well, I want to be offering prayer in my religion. And especially for people who consider themselves Christians, I think the big problem started when it was not completely and fully understood that when you give the education of children to anyone other than the church or Christian parents, or substitute the religion, it really doesn't matter in one sense, you are giving it to someone else, in this case, the government. And whatever worldview or religion by which the government operates, that's going to be inculcated in the educational process. Mm-hmm. Another way of saying it is that there is no neutral ground anywhere. So something like mathematics, English, literature, science, those things cannot be taught from a neutral position concerning worldview and philosophy. And so what's happened is over the past 40, 50, 60 years or more, we've had increasing encroachments of what we might call secularism into the school system, so that now they've become more or less social engineering factories as opposed to a place to genuinely educate children. You know, I recall when I was growing up in the early 60s in public schools, you'd walk into a classroom and, you know, everybody, there was sort of a regimented order of wooden desks. The teacher's desk was up front. You know, there might be pictures of American presidents across the front with the alphabet and lower and uppercase letters and a few things like that. Now you walk into these rooms and the desks are rearranged so that everything's sort of relational and the two students are looking at each other. The rooms are just gaudy with all kinds of artwork and mobiles hanging from the ceiling. There's really not that much emphasis on cognitive learning and knowledge. And that's all a result of an idea about what a child is and what it means to educate a child, and what the government school system has as its project for turning kids out of those schools to become, quote, good citizens. Mm-hmm. You know, what does it look like to be a good citizen? Well, increasingly that means supporting whatever the political party in power says should be done. whether it be concerning foreign wars, what defines a human being at conception or not, what defines a marriage, who can get married, what is a marriage, what is a family, all of these things. So the kinds of bizarre things that we see coming out of public schools, ranging from sex education that basically corrupts children from into a profoundly unbiblical perspective regarding human sexuality, to just a simple lack of education and understanding of things like math and science and history and things of that nature.
Okay, so your experience in the public school system, was sex education taught when you were in government schools? No. Okay, so explain to people what the strategy is of this, because when I was in government schools and I graduated K through 12 through them, we did have sex education classes, as we entered the time of puberty, and nobody warned me, and I don't think, I don't remember any kids getting pulled out of that class because their parents disagreed with it. What is the objective of that? Why is that being taught by schools when, for a long time it was never something that was part of the education that was done at government schools?
Because the agenda of the government is that the government, and especially its school systems, shall and has replaced the family as the primary source of learning and education about everything for a child. So, okay, you may be Roman Catholic, you may be Mormon, you may be Protestant, evangelical, Presbyterian, whatever it may be, and you may take your children to religious services every week. You may teach them some sort of catechism at home, but you don't have that child under your control Monday through Friday for 7 or 8 hours a day. And then you throw in with that the reinforcement of the ideas about human sexuality coming through the entertainment industry, like television and video games and things of that nature. The agenda is full bore, trying to completely obliterate any biblical perspective, any traditional Christian perspective about what human sexuality is and what it is that defines a man or a woman, a family, and the purpose of having two different sexes. This started early on. I don't know how far back you can remember this, but one of the first areas in which this began to be corrupted was the substitution for the word gender for the word sex. There are only two sexes, male and female. But, gender, you can have male, female, and neuter. That comes from language. And somewhere on the path, all that became corrupted, and I think public education was probably one conduit for that. So if you use the term gender, then it's fluid and you can come up with all different types of genders. So that's why you see this move away from the term sex and sexuality. But that in a nutshell is the agenda. Now, it may not be, if you pulled aside a teacher in some local government school who's teaching sex education or whatever they may call it, and say, excuse me, is your agenda to corrupt the biblical perspective on human sex? They're going to say no, they don't know anything about that. But they're just soldiers doing the work of a larger military force. They're not asking a lot of questions, and there are a lot of people who may consider themselves good Christians who teach in these schools. And then, it's important that the children get this perspective or whatever, however they explain it. But at the end of the day, it is exactly that. And we're seeing the fruition of it in our society and our culture.
How did this used to be handled? So before the government schools got involved in, the gender, changed their, the way they're operating when it comes to sex, and not defining males as males or females as females. Now it's, kids are being defined by which gender they identify with. How did that used to be handled when somebody, when let's say a young girl was a tomboy? What was the difference then between now, and how was the way it was done back then better than it is today?
Well, as I said a moment ago, the family was the primary unit, whatever its failings may be, where these kind of values and issues would be dealt with, going back in the earliest history of these United States, right up until the early 20th century and the mid 20th century. That doesn't mean it was perfect. And to be honest, I haven't completely thought through this, about the ups and downs and the ins and outs of it. But I know when I was growing up, I'm 66 years old. I grew up in the late 50s into the mid 60s when I was in public school. There were boys and girls who were marginal in terms of their behavior. Tomboys, effeminate boys, tomboys who were girls and effeminate boys. Sometimes these people were marginalized. They were made fun of, and that is very regrettable. We should be kind and loving and caring for all kinds of people. However,
Right.
there's something built into that, I think, that lets people know, even if they're on the unfortunate receiving end of it, that this really is not acceptable on some measure in our culture. And insofar as you make it acceptable, then you open the door for all the other things that come in. I'm not saying that's the only way to deal with it. But there are certain things even now, as declined as our culture's become, that I would like to think, at least, if somebody began manifesting a certain type of behavior, it used to be something like pedophilia, but now that's even going by the wayside, that there would be this sort of cultural gut reaction against it, because people had within their consciousness as a culture, this is wrong, this is not acceptable, this should not be done. So it was all handled on a more of a societal, cultural level, neighborhood level, if you will, rather than being legislated by government in a school system.
So let's change the subject. We're experiencing a huge tidal wave of kids graduating from government schools that are Bernie Sanders supporters. In fact, I was speaking to a gentleman yesterday, and he said he went up to sell T-shirts at the Democrat convention last go around back in 2016. And his job was to sell the Hillary Clinton books at the event. And what he said was there were no young Hillary Clinton supporters. They were all there to support Bernie Sanders. And so looking at that, Bernie Sanders is a socialist, Marxist. Why are so many kids that are being raised by families that are, their parents work hard, their parents are they're trying to put their kids on the right path. Why are so many of these kids becoming like they think the same way Bernie Sanders thinks? Can you explain that?
I think an explanation might be on a number of levels. First of all, it goes back to what I said a moment ago. If the family is turning over the children to a government school system, then whatever the government teaches concerning things like economics, the place of the poor in society, the issue of making money, greed, all these kind of things, they're going to get whatever is the government perspective on those things, along with other social agendas that have come through in the system. So when they come out, even if they're still in high school, they listen to these different candidates. And, I mean, on one level, the socialist Marxist project sounds like it's very sympathetic to the downtrodden, to those who are the victims of the evil capitalists and all the rest of it. So if you don't have the proper tools mentally and cognitively to deal with that, you can be easily swayed by those things. So I think the first explanation is that there's a failure on the part of the family to properly educate children in their homes. Even if they are in public school, you can still have a responsibility to do this, about the problems with these different types of social and political versions of managing an economy versus the biblical perspective about individual liberty and freedom. And then the other thing is the way these things are portrayed in media. And it's become so polarized. If all you're going to watch are CNN and MSNBC and the other, commie left-wing outlets, then you're going to get a certain perspective and a caricature. And so that's the reason they turn out for Bernie.
Were you taught Darwinism when you were in the public school system?
Yes.
Okay. What was that like for you, being raised in a Christian household? Were you caught off guard, or did your parents prepare you for the agenda of Darwinism?
My parents did not. My situation perhaps is a little different than others. I was raised in a mainline Protestant family that was not super conservative theologically, politically, and socially. Here in South Carolina in the early and mid 60s, you had people who were socially conservative on issues like civil rights and things of that nature. but their churches had long since been compromised through their seminaries and the professors' teaching. So the idea was that if you believed in something other, like, say, for example, a biblical perspective of a literal 6-day creation, or even theistic evolution, you were some kind of rube who fell off the back of a turnip truck. That's not intelligent. That's not scientific. So that, again, there was no question, well, this is what they're teaching in the school. The government knows best. So my children need to be educated and not, become simpletons by believing what that Bible thumping, fire breathing, crazy evangelist guy says. And that's sort of the caricature that was put together. So, and now, of course, Darwinianism is a religious fact. It is a religiously accepted fact, and the conduits of that religion that promote it, which is, in this case, the government school system.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Somebody, and maybe we'll get around to this, I don't know, but somebody who wrote a lot about these kind of issues was our good friend, the late Sam Blumenfeld. Mm-hmm. Dr. Blumenfeld wrote a number of books, and he himself was involved in education for many years, detailing many of these things that we're talking about right now.
What strategies do we have? The average American family cannot afford to have somebody at home. We do have a lot of churches, especially in South Carolina, that have nothing going on Monday through Friday. What should church members do that watch this video if they start to think that maybe we need to create safe havens for these kids? I know there's already a lot of Christian schools, but there's really a lot of parents that just cannot afford it, and there's a lot of parents that neither of them are at home during the day. What strategies should we implement to try to give parents the option of not sending their kids to the government schools?
I think it depends on the circumstance of the family. If it's a young family, they're just a young couple who are just starting out, maybe their kids are in infancy stage or they haven't started a family, I think they need to make a strong commitment that they will either educate their children at home, homeschooling, in which I think South Carolina is a fairly friendly homeschool state. My wife and I home educated our children right up through high school in the state of New York, where it wasn't all that easy, but we got it done. Mm-hmm. It's a sacrifice. It's a decision that you must make, that this is something very important. It's amazing how many people will write down the time the Super Bowl is going to start and move hell and high water to make sure they're in front of their TV sets when the game starts. But when it comes to something like this, it doesn't have the same kind of priority. And you're going to have that kind of result. Make it a priority if you are in a position to do that, to teach your children at home or put them in a Christian school that is not just another version of a public school with Bible reading. Unfortunately, mm-hmm. that's been a way many Christian schools have been compromised through the issue of accreditation, sports programs. Okay, well, you want to participate in sports with the other high schools or whatever, you've got to be accredited or you've got to agree to this part of the education department's credentials or guidelines. So a good Christian school is also an alternative if home education is not an option. If your kids are already in either of those two situations, then again, it requires a sacrificial commitment that I'm going to spend a certain amount of time with my children every week to make sure that they're getting a biblical perspective, a Christian traditional perspective on all the issues that they're being exposed to in the government school system that are totally contrary to what you want them to believe.
Right now, the John Birch Society is educating about 1,000 students across the world, most of them in the United States, through our academy. It's called Freedom Project Academy, and you know a little bit about this. I don't know if you've met Dr. Duke Pesta, but you've got to know him. You have met him, okay? Yeah. But we offer through the Freedom Project Academy a way for parents who may not be comfortable with homeschooling their kids, but maybe one is at home. We offer them a way to just use Freedom Project Academy, and it's about $2,000 per year and plus books. Would you recommend that parents look into that and try to get involved in that?
I absolutely would. And let me also mention that when I was pastor of a church in upstate New York, during the time my wife and I were homeschooling our kids, we united together with about 30 or 40 other homeschooling families to have a homeschool co-op at my church.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple of times a week, we had about 60 or 70 kids and their parents, usually the wives, and we would have classes. And you just had to have a bachelor's degree to teach a particular class, math, science, politics, all kinds of things that we taught. This is a purely individual, local level effort. Something like the Freedom Project curriculum. Ron Paul has a homeschool curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
There are really, really good resources out there, but the one that you just mentioned, I think, would be an excellent one.
Well, thank you, Pastor Charles Roberts, for participating in this Berkshire conference call. Do you have any final words before? I mean, do you have a final word for pastors out there that may be in the same boat you are, and they're trying to figure things out because they're noticing a lot of their kids that are in public schools are not excited about God, excited about following God, and they may. And it's hard for pastors sometimes to figure out what these kids are thinking, but what they do know is these kids are going to public school, and as they grow up, they're no longer excited about going to church and participating. Do you have any advice for them?
Well, if I may, I would like to recommend this book by Sam Blumenfeld. It's called Is Public Education Necessary? He also before he died, this book was published, Revolution via Education. There's some essays by Sam Blumenfeld. And then Crimes of the Educators. Alex Newman also worked on this with him. These would be excellent resources for pastors to use to understand what the children are being exposed to, what's the background history of public education, why this needs to be a topic that as a pastor, a priest, a religious leader, you need to be concerned about.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much. How do people contact you if they want to contact you and ask you questions about those books or just about other things?
You can contact me via my email address, which is Reverend Charles H. Roberts at gmail.com. That's REV for Reverend, REVCHARLESHROBERTS, Rev Charles H. Roberts at gmail.com.
All right, thank you so much for joining this conference call, and we'll move on to the Q&A session for those involved in this conference call. For those listening, please share this, and please go to the Berkshire podcast and listen to more of our episodes and share those if you would. This is one way we can fight back against the conspiracy to destroy our constitutional republic, to destroy our families, and the way we do that is through education. So thank you everybody for watching, and for those that are on this conference call, we're going to stop the recording and we'll move on to the Q&A session of this.